England. Once dominated by Roman conquerors, this tiny island nation rose to become one of the largest and most powerful empires in history. Its reach stretched around the globe, spanning every continent.
It was unimaginably large.
Technology, innovation, ambition, these were the tools that built this massive empire and produced the formidable British Navy, a powerhouse that dominated the world's oceans.
The Royal Navy is like the Microsoft of the global system in the 18th and 19th century. They are everywhere.
The British Empire constructed massive symbols of dominance that still invoke awe today. But the foundations of that empire were built on ego, bloodshed, and a relentless drive for conquest. AD, the most powerful empire the world had ever known is under attack. At the far edges of the British Isles, the once mighty Roman legions march toward the coast in full retreat. They leave in their wake a military and political void. For the first time in more than 400 years, the vulnerable island nation of Britain must fend for itself. It was the end of one empire and the beginning of another.
The sun never sets on the British Empire. I've heard those words all my life, ever since I was a kid, even though I've never lived in England, and that empire is long gone. Hello, I'm Peter Weller. At its height, the British Empire covered almost a quarter of the Earth's land mass, some 14 million square miles, and if you think about that, that's just staggering. But how did an island, if you will, in the middle of the North Atlantic come to be such a behemoth empire? Well, in the early 400s AD, when those Roman citizens were fleeing in the face of an onslaught of Vikings and Jutes and Angles and Saxons, some of those marauding and plundering people decided to stay. Maybe they liked the temperate climate. And after several centuries, they'd organized and developed themselves into somewhat of an Anglo or English identity. But with the death of the last true Saxon king, Edward the Confessor, the door was open for another people to step in, the Normans, who were essentially descendants of the Vikings living in northern France. And at the Battle of Hastings in 1066, the Normans did that very thing. They took England under the leadership of a man named William, who we call today William the Conqueror.
With a ravenous lust for power, William would stop at nothing to become King of England.
To conquer another country like England, you couldn't really be a sort of touchy-feely kind of person. You had to be a very strong leader, and that's what he was. He was a brutal man.
In 1066, William made his move. He put together an army of Normans and stormed the shores of England. For several bloody hours, his forces viciously clashed with King Harold's near the English coastal town of Hastings. By the end of the day, with one strike, William had conquered England. Now he would borrow a chapter from the Romans and launch a series of extraordinary building projects that would transform the English landscape.
He imposes himself on England, and he builds these castles around the country. Now, we look at castles, and we think, don't they look nice? A Norman castle is not nice. It was big, it towered over your town, and it was a reminder to say that you are under us now. And of course, the biggest one he builds is the Tower of London.
William wanted the Tower of London to be intimidating. He chose a location on the bank of the River Thames that had once been used by the Romans. The new tower would be built on those foundations, capitalizing on the Roman legacy of power and glory. The complex would include a defensive wall surrounding an imposing tower.
can get rid of me. Of course, the people they use to build it are the locals who have to do it, so they use them effectively as slave labor.
Building onto the remains of the Roman walls, workers first constructed the barrier around the complex. On the north and west side, where there were no Roman remains, they dug ditches and erected large wooden stakes as a barricade. Then they turned to the massive tower itself. For 700 years, England had relied on simple timber construction. Now William and the Normans would bring back the grandeur of Roman engineering techniques. Like the Romans, William would build his tower with stone. He didn't trust the quality of the local material, so he imported cream-colored limestone from France. His engineers also incorporated Romanesque arches and vaults within the structure for support. Inside the tower's majestic cathedral, workers constructed a series of intersecting barrel vaults, called groin vaults. These allowed the support to rest on 4 piers, opening a soaring space for windows to lighten the imposing interior.
It was a great feat for that time because the English were used to building in wood, so I think it was rather miraculous for them to see this enormous structure go up. It was really impregnable. I mean, the walls were tremendously thick and there were just little slits to look out from.
The fearsome castle served as a royal residence, fort, stronghold, and prison. And intimidation was backed up by swift and severe reprisal against any who dared challenge the king.
You get armed men, and they go up, and they land on your doorstep. They will drive you out of your home. They will burn your home down. They will burn your crops, so you've got nothing to live on. And a lot of killing, of course.
As the tower neared completion in 1087, William died, ending 21 years of turbulent rule. His imposing fortress would be a reminder of his vision and tyranny for centuries to come. A series of Norman kings succeeded William and continued his work on the complex. But it would be more than 400 years later that the tower would enter its bloodiest phase. And the king who led it there was not Norman, but from the English family of Tudors. He would become one of the most brutal and gluttonous rulers in England's history. His name was Henry VIII. Henry's appetites were legendary. He hungered for food, for women, for power, and for a son who would one day inherit the crown.
The best way to fulfill your duty and your destiny as a king is to produce a safe line of male heirs. And if you look at the portraits of Tudor gentlemen, they're standing with their legs apart and their hands on their hips with these big codpieces. That is not by accident. That is saying, I am virile. Look at me, I can produce families. So son is a sign of manhood.
When his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, failed to produce a son, Henry set his sights on one of her ladies-in-waiting, the alluring Anne Boleyn.
He falls absolutely hopelessly both in love and in lust with Anne Boleyn, because Anne is a very, very sexy lady, and she knows it. There's only one problem. How do you get rid of your wife? Apart from murdering her, of course. And the answer is, I've got to divorce her.
When the Pope refused to grant Henry a divorce, the king flew into a rage. If he couldn't control his country's religion, he would simply replace it. He boldly severed all ties with Rome and appointed himself head of the new Church of England. Henry now had absolute control over his country. He divorced Catherine and made Anne his queen. But when she also failed to produce a son, she suddenly found herself accused of adultery.
The case is made as damaging as it's possible to be, that she's not just having one affair, that she's having a string of affairs, that there are sort of orgies going on in the palace, and Henry is only too ready to believe a lot of this.
Henry had Anne arrested and held in the greatly expanded Tower of London. By now, the tower complex had grown to a sprawling 18 acres with an impenetrable facade. The wooden barricade had been replaced and expanded by thick stone walls. A series of towers reinforced their strength and stability. Just inside the outer wall, a second wall was constructed, to provide another layer of fortification. A ditch had been dug around the perimeter and filled with water to form a moat. With these added defenses, the tower complex was virtually undefeatable. Under Henry's ruthless reign, the fortress became the location for an orgy of violence, a notorious prison, dungeon, and execution ground for his many enemies. And it was here that Anne awaited her fate, death by beheading.
Axe executions were actually really nasty because it was not uncommon for the axe not to finish the job in one blow. What he does with Anne Boleyn, he says, "For you, darling, nothing but the best." Instead of having her beheaded with an axe, he's going to have her beheaded nice and neatly with a sword.
On May 19, 1536, Anne was led to a private courtyard on the tower's grounds. With one swift stroke, Henry's problem was solved. But Henry's longing for a son was only part of a more ambitious quest. Since the beginning of his reign, he had lusted after a dream of ultimate glory, to transform England into an empire.
This idea of a realm that would cover every part of Europe and extend beyond was always in the back of Henry VIII's mind. His real vision and dream, his great appetite was for dominion and empire.
But Henry's road to empire put him on a collision course with France and Spain, Europe's reigning superpowers. His plan of attack, to fill the high seas with floating weapons of mass destruction. 6 ravens are always kept at the Tower of London. Legend has it that if they leave, the kingdom will fall. Summer 1510. An army of laborers scour England's forests, gathering material for a colossal undertaking on England's road to empire. Before King Henry VIII could conquer the land, he needed to conquer the sea. He set out to radically transform the way battles were fought and won by turning his ships into deadly weapons.
He is the one who first begins putting heavy guns on ships. To put these large siege warfare type guns, ship cracking guns, some of them weighing almost a ton, on shipboard that could be used to batter your enemy into submission.
Massive guns required massive ships. Henry ordered his naval engineers to build a new and imposing fleet. The centerpiece, his flagship, was one of the world's first battleships. It was called the Mary Rose.
The Mary Rose really epitomizes the mentality of naval planners of that age. Get as many guns pointing as many directions on shipboard as you possibly can. And that's what the Mary Rose was set to become, a gun platform.
The Mary Rose featured a breakthrough advance in warship design, gun ports. Holes were carved into the side of the ship with flaps that could be lowered over them. These holes allowed cannons to be positioned and fired through the side. Naval designers could now engineer decks dedicated solely to firepower. The added weapons turned the Mary Rose into a killing machine.
This was a major revolution, really, in ship design, of which the Mary Rose was at the sort of very beginning.
By the mid-16th century, England's march toward naval dominance was in full flow. But Henry soon ran into a problem. The cost of arming his ships with expensive bronze guns was quickly draining England's treasure chest.
He's got to find other ways to produce the kinds of, heavy artillery which can help his armies and his navy fight effectively, but at a lower cost. And the cast iron gun's the perfect solution. The cast iron gun runs less than a fifth of the cost of a bronze one.
A successful cast iron cannon had never been made before, but Henry knew how to make it happen. He turned to the country's famous iron-making region, the Weald, and gave his engineers a mandate.
The difficulty with casting in iron a large piece like a cannon was the fact that, for a start, iron had to be melted at a much higher temperature.
There was only one way to get the temperatures high enough, an engineering wonder of the time, the blast furnace. First, workers poured wood and iron ore into the top of a 20-foot-tall stone furnace. A water wheel powered a large bellows that pumped air into the fire, stoking it until it reached an incredible 2,200 degrees, hot enough to melt the iron. Workers then opened a tap at the base of the furnace. A stream of hot, molten iron poured down a trough and filled a cannon mold buried deep in the ground.
It was a very big undertaking, and it was very pressured as well. You had, of course, charcoal burners who produced the charcoal in the woods around the furnace. You had laborers who dug the iron ore from pits in the ground. You had teams of laborers bringing wagon loads of ore and charcoal to the furnace.
Over the next few centuries, the wheeled iron cannons became the envy and dread of every other European ruler.
The transformation is tremendous. It gave England power and a technological edge that no other European power could match.
In just 30 years, Henry had built his navy into a powerhouse, but he would never live to see his ultimate dream of European conquest. Enormously obese, his oversized appetites finally betrayed him. He died in January 1547, leaving a legacy of brutality and innovation that stands through the ages. His reign had laid the seeds that would explode into a mighty empire.
And Henry lays the foundations all right by building a navy, by building this notion of Britain as forming an empire, an imperial presence in the world.
Backed by the growing power of their navy, England's empire would expand over the next 150 years through colonization and conquest. By the mid-18th century, Britain controlled parts of India, Africa, the West Indies, and North America. But two major threats to the burgeoning empire loomed ahead, and the king who would fight them, George III, would also be battling demons of his own.
It's always talked about as his madness. It was a physical illness that he had, but the effect was that it affected his brain.
George first slipped into madness in 1788, 7 years after suffering a withering blow. A small territory a world away had defeated the mighty British in a war of independence. It was called America.
When the British troops leave Yorktown, when they surrender, they play this tune, "The World Turned Upside Down." And that is really how it seems. The world hasn't turned upside down, the world's gone mad. When rebels win.
Over the next decade, George's world slowly caved in on him. Then in 1804, another threat would send the king and his empire spiraling to the brink. French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte. By the early 1800s, the tyrannical conqueror was quickly overtaking Europe. England was his last obstacle to continental dominance.
He was as large a threat as the Nazis were in the Second World War. He was amassing the forces for an invasion of the British Isles.
England's Royal Navy had become a major force at sea, and in 1805, it faced Napoleon's invasion threat head-on in the momentous Battle of Trafalgar. Using fearless naval tactics and the most technically advanced ships of the age, England annihilated the combined forces of the French and Spanish fleets.
Trafalgar confirms Britain's position as the supreme maritime power, and the British emerge as the unsurpassed masters of those naval technologies.
But by the time of Napoleon's final defeat in 1815, King George III was permanently gripped by insanity, becoming a mere figurehead of power.
His mind is completely gone. His eyesight goes as well, and he wanders up and down the corridors of Windsor Castle, has to be fed like a baby. Long beard, long hair, no idea what day it is. It's just very sad.
By this time, England was growing rapidly into a superpower, based on the supremacy of its naval engineering. But it would be another realm of technical superiority that would catapult the British Empire to global dominance. The 19th century was about to usher in a period of engineering invention not seen since the Romans. The Mary Rose sank in a battle with the French in 1545. In 1982, the ship was raised from the bottom of the sea. By the 19th century, Britain had developed into an industrial titan, bursting with wealth. Its monumental success came from a period of staggering technological invention that swept across the empire and then dominated the globe.
It's hard to think of a period in history where you had so much creativity in terms of technology, so much willing to experiment with the possibilities of what you can do with machines, what you can do with engineering, what you can do with architecture.
In the past, empires had been built by hand. Now the British would dominate their territory with machines.
Engineering innovations like cast iron and the turning of a warship into a single ballistic offensive entity with guns transformed the English Navy. And that Navy transformed England into an empire. And that military and commercial empire that spread from Europe to Asia, from the Americas to Africa, dominated the seas. But what about the land? Because by the early 1800s, Britain was jumping with productivity, but lacking in means of overland distribution. Well, in 1782, a man named James Watt perfected an engine driven by steam. But it was 40 years later that George Stephenson and his son Robert took that engine and with a firebox, boiler, piston, and a remarkable invention called the chimney, powered a locomotive called the rocket over tracks at the blistering speed of 29 miles an hour and revolutionized overland commercial transportation with the railroad.
The rocket was not the first locomotive, but its unique engineering features proved that steam trains were the force of the future. The key to its speed was in its engine. A series of copper pipes carried hot gases from a coal-fueled firebox through a chamber of water, bringing it to a boil. This created steam that rose up into a dome and was forced through a valve into a cylinder. The intense pressure from the steam pushed a piston rod that connected to the wheels of the locomotive, powering it forward. By venting the exhaust steam out of a chimney instead of the cylinder, fresh air was sucked into the firebox, stoking the fire. With this advance, the rocket could charge ahead at blazing speeds.
Of all the locomotives that were imagined at the time, it's the one that looks the most like a locomotive will. I mean, it's going to be improved in innumerable ways, but that basic machine is the one that emerges as a locomotive for the next century.
The race was on to build railroads across Britain. And in 1833, a brilliant and brash engineer rose to prominence when he entered the railroad game. His name was Isambard Kingdom Brunel.
Brunel was a real showman. He dressed well, he had a beautiful wife. He was a celebrity, and he knew how to play that to a hilt. He was also a workaholic. He had a very difficult time delegating.
Brunel had a bold vision for his railway. It would be the most ambitious project to date, a massive network of railroads connecting all of England together. He called it the Great Western Railway, and he was determined to make it the fastest line ever created.
He wanted a track which was on a very, very shallow gradient so that the trains would be able to travel that much faster.
The need for speed meant going through mountains rather than over them, and this led to his greatest engineering marvel. Today, it is known as the Box Tunnel.
It was necessary essentially to chisel through rock, and the length of the tunnel was something like 1 3/4 miles, which was really astonishing for this time. That's a really serious tunnel, even by today's standards.
Brunel amassed hundreds of Irish workers called navvies to dig the tunnel. They began by sinking a series of shafts from the top of the hill. Gunpowder was used to blast through the rock. Then the navvies were lowered in baskets down the shaft, where they excavated the materials with basic hand tools. Horses turned winches that pulled the material to the top of the hill.
It was a slow, painful, and sometimes quite a dangerous process, of course. And there were fatalities on the box tunnel during its construction. Lots of dust, lots of grime, and when the explosions were going off, the risk of flying rock.
After 4 years of work that claimed more than 100 lives, the box tunnel was finished. The Great Western Railway finally opened in 1841. Trains still run through the box tunnel to this day. The railway mania that Brunel helped ignite eventually spread to the rest of the empire, tightening England's stranglehold on power around the world.
Railways in the middle of the 19th century, first in England and then wherever they spread, they're sources of just incredible wonder. They're big, they're loud, they're dirty, and they're just power. And they represent speed, they represent the conquest of space and time. They're literally awesome machines.
With the runaway success of the railway, Britain was now decades ahead of the rest of the world in modern engineering technology. Their empire was fast approaching its apex. But a staggering blow to its nerve center would rattle the empire to its very foundations. The first person to be killed by a train was a member of Parliament. He was struck by the rocket in 1830. October 1834. In the dark of the London night, a violent fire rages through the very heart of the British Empire, Westminster Palace. For centuries, this complex of buildings had been the command center of British power and a towering symbol of its strength. Now, as flames turn the palace into a roaring inferno, thousands watch in shock and horror, wondering what will become of their mighty government.
The fire of 1834 had dealt a devastating blow to the political nerve center of the British Empire. Westminster Palace had stood in some form or another since the late 11th century during the time of William the Conqueror. And now these ruins had the British people wondering, would Parliament ever meet again in this place? Would Parliament ever rise and vote again in these magnificent buildings that had given birth to the modern political process? Well, a royal commission was appointed to decide this very thing, and the royal commission decided, yes, Parliament would be reconstructed in this place. But now a more difficult question came up. What would these buildings look like? Would they be neo-Gothic, French, Italian, or English? Or would they be the perpendicular style of Elizabethan Tudor or English Renaissance? A sort of a civic war happened for 2 years until 1836. The Royal Commission, over 97 proposals, chose the plan of a man named Charles Barry, who was a fan of the Italian Renaissance, but he combined those elements with neo-Gothic, and he gave us this. The Houses of Parliament we have today, a sort of a mishmash of styles, but a stunning mishmash nonetheless.
From the ruins of the old Parliament, British architects would design a government building of staggering proportions, twice the size of the U.S. Capitol. Constructed of sand-colored limestone called Anston, the palace would take up 8 acres of land, with towers soaring as much as 320 feet into the sky. It was decided that one of these massive structures would be a grand clock tower. Today, we know it as Big Ben.
You're able to measure time much more accurately in the 19th century, and time is important. Time comes to mean money, and there's something of a revolution in the 19th century about timekeeping. So if you're going to have this latest building, yeah, a clock tower goes on it.
When the royal astronomer George Airy announced his requirements for the clock, people were stunned. It would be the largest and most ambitious timepiece the world had ever seen.
Now, Airy's demands for excellence were fairly rigorous. For instance, one of his requirements was that the clock be accurate to within 1 second every 24-hour period, and furthermore, that the accuracy reports of this clock be telegraphed on down the River Thames to the Greenwich Observatory twice a day. Now, this was not the 21st century age of information. A digital clockmaker today, this would not be shooting for the moon. But a 19th century clockmaker, to make such a great clock in a huge tower with such heavy striking mechanisms, pushing such heavy hands, with such precision and such accuracy, that would be exposed to the rain, wind, and elements second after second, hour after hour, week after week, year after year. This was absolutely unimaginable. It was like going to the moon. So Parliament, rightfully, asked Airy if he might come up with a plan that was a little bit more reasonable, a little less expensive. But Airy was adamant. And thus the clock today we call Big Ben, which is really the name of the bell, became the standard for timekeeping the world over.
Incredibly, it was an amateur clockmaker by the name of Edmund Beckett Denison who designed the famous clock when all other experts failed to meet the challenge of pinpoint accuracy. Like all clocks of this type, Denison's would be powered by weights, gears, and a pendulum. But Big Ben's design featured a groundbreaking new device that would protect the pendulum from outside forces. 2 metal arms control a wheel with 3 spokes. With each swing of the pendulum, one of the arms opens, allowing the wheel to turn a notch. This regulates the movement of the clock. When rain or snow weighs down the clock's hands, the arms isolate the pendulum so it keeps swinging without being affected. To fine-tune the clock's accuracy, timekeepers simply reach into their own pockets.
Pennies are used as part of its regulating its accuracy. By adding or taking away one of these old pennies from the pendulum, the clock can actually gain or lose 2/5 of a second in 24 hours.
With this brilliant but simple method, the clock became world famous as a marvel of precision engineering.
The clock tower over the Parliament at the centre of the empire has a peculiarly powerful symbolic importance. It's as if time itself is governed by the British.
In addition to the clock, a series of bells was needed to toll the passing time, with an enormous central bell ringing on the hour. A bell founder by the name of George Mears cast the giant bell to Denison's precise specifications, and Big Ben was born, weighing a staggering 13 tons. Huge crowds lined the streets of London and cheered as Big Ben was transported to the finished clock tower in 1858. It has been filling London with its distinctive rings ever since.
London grew as a city tremendously. It was really the first large-scale conurbation in the world. And as a city, it had to have its icons, and the ultimate icon being the Mother of Parliaments, the Parliamentary Building, with Big Ben as a symbol of the strength and the power of the British Empire.
By the mid-19th century, Great Britain had set the gold standard for technological achievement. But under the reign of a young, naive queen, a crisis would strike London and push it to the brink of disaster. A flock of birds landed on the minute hand of Big Ben in 1949 and set the time back 5 minutes. In 1837, a teenage girl takes the reins of the most powerful empire on earth. Her rise to power ignites turmoil throughout Great Britain. Both her subjects and her government view her as spoiled, impetuous, and unprepared to rule. Her name was Queen Victoria.
She was only 18 when she came to the throne, and she'd had a very, very difficult first couple of years on the throne, and in fact was very unpopular.
There was little to indicate this immature girl would grow up to become a revered symbol of the empire's immense power. Her transformation started when she married her cousin Albert in 1840.
She fell in love almost at first sight. All her life, actually, she wants someone to lean on. metaphorically and indeed literally. And Albert is able to take her in hand, rather. So he comes in and he helps her grow up.
By this time, the empire stretched around the world, from North America to Australia. Albert and Victoria pushed for greatness in engineering and technology, knowing how crucial these advances were to their expanding empire. None more so than the emerging technology of the telegraph.
You've got an empire which is extending literally around the globe. People talked about the annihilation of space and time through electrical telegraph.
The telegraph industry exploded around the world, with Britain leading the charge. During the mid-19th century, over 97,000 miles of twisted steel telegraph cables were laid. A message could now be sent from Britain to India in a matter of hours. The world's first information superhighway had arrived, and with it, the empire could consolidate its power more effectively than ever before.
It was an enormous feat, no question. It's something which simply was not conceivable before they did it.
Engineering advances not only united the empire, they triggered a manufacturing boom unlike any seen before. People flocked from rural areas to city centers to take advantage of job opportunities. And as productivity skyrocketed, so did the population of its nerve center, London.
So whereas it had been 1 million at the beginning of the 19th century, it was then, by the 1850s, it was already 2 million. And London was not designed for this. And there was terrible overcrowding. Really, people were living as though they were in a chicken coop.
London was bursting with people. Cramped and overcrowded, sanitation problems spread like wildfire. Waste flowed into sewers meant only for rainwater, filling it with raw sewage that emptied directly into the Thames River. The situation was ripe for disaster.
Now, you would think the Thames, huge river, that would be a great way of disposing of London's waste. But unfortunately, it was also London's water supply. So the waste of 2 million Londoners was being shunted into the Thames, and then Londoners were actually drinking this.
1848. Catastrophe strikes London. A cholera epidemic sweeps through the congested city, killing more than 14,000. 3 years later, another outbreak occurs, claiming an additional 10,000 victims. Cemeteries fill up with bodies. The most advanced city in the world faced conditions that had not been seen since the Black Death of the Middle Ages.
In the space of 30 years, over 30,000 Londoners died, and this was because of cholera, and because cholera was spreading through London's polluted water supply. It was shocking.
Something needed to be done. England turned to an engineer by the name of Joseph Bazalgette. His solution would revolutionize urban planning. He and thousands of city workers would build the most advanced sewer system to date. Bazalgette's innovative plan was to install giant intercepting sewers on each side of the Thames, running parallel to the water. These main pipes would be connected to more than 1,300 miles of older city sewers, collecting the waste and diverting it away from the river.
The genius of the system was that gravity was used wherever possible to actually move the sewage out of London. So the sewers actually ran at an incline.
When gravity wasn't enough to carry the flow, Bazalgette built grand pumping stations. There, large steam-driven engines lifted the sewage until gravity could take over once again. The sewers guided the waste into 2 deep reservoirs, where it would be stored and released at high tide, when nature could dispose of it neatly.
The sewer system really was one of the marvels of the 19th century. It used 300 million bricks. There was extraordinary earth moving. It was a truly colossal task and brilliant, amazing.
This extraordinary engineering feat transformed London into the first modern glittering metropolis. Cities throughout Europe studied its design with awe. But the disease epidemic wouldn't be the last crisis of Victoria's reign.
If you read Hard Times or Oliver Twist or David Copperfield or any of the other genius works by Charles Dickens, you'll get a sense of the staggering overpopulation in London in the 19th century. And some of the fallout of this horror was the sheer volume of traffic in London, a chaos of pedestrians and horses and carriages and carts hauling everything from hay to hardware. The traffic from the south alone was bottlenecking the London Bridge such that London felt like it was choking to death on its own success. London needed another river crossing, but a traditional bridge would block the big merchant boats coming upriver to the port. No, what London needed was a drawbridge, like that one.
The drawbridge would be the largest and most sophisticated of its kind. It would be called the Tower Bridge. The structure is solid steel covered in stone to make it look like the nearby Tower of London. When the bridge was built, the 1,200-ton leaves, or bascules, were lifted by steam-driven engines. The power turned toothed pinions along a curved steel rack, riveted to the outside girders. A solid pivot rotated as the pinion raised the structure. The bascules lifted to an 83-degree angle, allowing ships to pass through.
The rising of the bridge only took 1 minute to raise it, so it was an incredible feat of engineering.
It took more than 400 men and 8 years to build Tower Bridge. Today, it is one of the most famous and recognizable bridges in the world. Despite being the driving force behind these staggering works of engineering, Albert didn't live to see them. He died in 1861, shattering Victoria.
Queen Victoria fell into grief the like you have never seen.
For close to 10 years, Victoria sat in isolation from her country. But when she finally re-emerged into public life, she was stronger and more powerful than ever before. The immature teenager had redefined herself into a ruler of the modern age and took her rightful place as leader of the British Empire.
All over the world, statues to Victoria are erected. There are massive celebrations all over the world, and in many cases, those celebrations are joined by the colonized peoples. She becomes a figure of affection.
Victoria had become the symbol of the empire's splendor and might, and her reign would mark the apex of British power around the world. The British Empire now had possessions on every major continent, and could claim more than 400 million people under its rule. No other country could rival its immense power. It was the largest empire the world would ever see.
Queen Victoria died in 1901 at the dawn of the 20th century. She presided over a realm as large, as optimistic, confident, and as innovative as any in history. The British Empire had dragged mankind smashing into the modern age with mass production, rapid transit and communication. The world would never be the same. Every single country and culture on this planet today has benefited in some way or another from British vision and imagination. The sun may have finally set on the British Empire, but regarding the miracles of the modern age, the sun never burned brighter. For the History Channel, I'm Peter Weller.